All right, settle in, everyone. We are about to get into something truly fundamental, that age-old question. How did we actually get here? How did all this life around us come to be?
It's a huge question. And it's surrounded by, well, let's just say a lot of ideas, some complex science, and definitely some myths.
Yeah, a fair bit of misunderstanding, too, which is why we've gathered this stack of materials, different articles, some videos that tackle exactly this. They look at common evolution myths, human evolution, and even offer some contrasting views.
It's quite a mix, actually.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to cut through all that noise for you. We're going to unpack this stuff together.
Pull out the key pieces of info, maybe some surprising facts.
Exactly. Give you a kind of shortcut to understanding what these particular sources are saying about this really big topic, how it all fits together, or sometimes how it doesn't.
And we'll tackle those common myths head on. We'll look at what the scientific consensus presented in these sources says.
But also explore the other perspectives that are in the material, too, keeping it balanced.
Right. We're just laying out what's in these sources you've provided. No agenda, just exploring the ideas presented.
Okay, let's start with a big one. Probably the most common myth you hear. Evolution is only a theory.
Ah, yes. And that word theory causes a lot of confusion, doesn't it?
It really does, because in everyday chat, a theory is just like a hunch, a guess.
Right. But in science, as these sources really emphasize, it means something, well, much more robust.
So what is it then, scientifically speaking?
A scientific theory, according to this material, is this big, comprehensive explanation. It covers a whole range of observations, phenomena.
And crucially,
It's backed up by a massive amount of evidence.
Oh.
Seriously, mountains of it.
so not a guess at all. It's like the best explanation we have, built on solid data.
Precisely. And the sources point out that this is why the vast majority of scientists accept evolution. It's because of all that proof.
And they list the fields that contribute, right? Like,
Yeah, embryology, paleontology, fossils, comparative anatomy, looking at structures, molecular biology, genetics. It's coming from all these different angles.
multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing the same way. That sounds powerful.
It is. Which actually brings up another interesting point from the sources. The word evolution itself, it gets used in different ways.
How so?
Well, one source makes a clear distinction. It talks about evolution, meaning, things change over time,
Yeah.
like bacteria becoming resistant to drugs. It says that's observable, accepted.
Okay, small scale changes. Makes sense.
But then it contrasts that with what it calls evolution in the sense of molecules to man. The big picture, common descent over millions of years.
And that source disputes that idea.
Yes, based on its specific criteria for what counts as observable science. So it's highlighting this difference in scale and how different people view the evidence for each scale.
That's a really important distinction to understand up front. It shapes how the different arguments we'll see are framed.
Definitely sets the stage.
Okay, let's shift gears to human evolution. And probably the most persistent image, that sort of linear march from ape to human, the idea we evolved directly from monkeys.
Right, that classic but quite misleading drawing. The sources are very clear. That's not the scientific picture.
So we didn't descend from the monkeys we see today.
No, it's more about shared ancestry. Humans, monkeys, apes, we all share a common ancestor way, way back.
So it's like we're cousins, distant cousins on a big family tree.
Exactly. Think of it as a branching tree, not a straight ladder. We took one path, modern apes and monkeys took others, all stemming from shared roots.
And those roots are really far back in time.
Oh yeah. The sources mention the common ancestor with monkeys lived something like 50 million years ago.
50 million, wow.
And the one we share with apes, like chimpanzees, is more recent, but still maybe over 5 million years ago.
So definitely not a simple monkey to human step.
Not at all. And one source actually points out that this whole humans from little monkeys idea wasn't even what early evolutionary scientists proposed. It's often used as a kind of misrepresentation.
A simplification that misses the whole point of the branching tree.
Precisely.
And speaking of simplistic ideas, what about the missing link? That idea that we just need to find one specific fossil to connect everything?
Yeah, that term comes up a lot, but the sources say it's really outdated and, frankly, misleading.
Why misleading?
Because evolution isn't seen as a single chain needing one link. It's that complex branching tree again, maybe even more like a web. We don't expect just one link.
Instead, we have
many fossils that show transitional features that are intermediate between different groups. It's not about one magic bullet fossil.
Right, because the actual story of early humans, according to these sources, is much messier and more interesting than one single line.
Absolutely. This is one of the most fascinating parts. For a long, long time, quadruped humans, Homo sapiens, we weren't alone.
Really? Who else was around?
Several other types of humans, other hominid species. The sources mention Neanderthals, Denisovans, maybe others too. They shared the planet with our direct ancestors for thousands of years.
Wow. Different kinds of humans living at the same time. That's hard to picture.
It is. And the sources mention something else incredible about Neanderthals.
What's that?
They weren't our direct ancestors on that line leading to us, but early Homo sapiens migrating out of Africa actually met them and interbred with them.
No way. So we have Neanderthal DNA.
Many modern humans, especially outside of Africa, carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. It's a direct genetic echo of those ancient encounters.
That's amazing. A tangible link to those other humans.
It really is. And it fits the broader picture. Our species, Homo sapiens, started in Africa, then spread across the globe.
Adapting to all sorts of different environments as they went.
Exactly. And the source have pushed back against the stereotype of these early humans being primitive or brutish.
Right. They weren't just grunting cavemen.
Not at all. The material highlights their capabilities. They made sophisticated tools. They formed societies. They even express themselves through art, like those incredible cave paintings.
Complex people living complex lives alongside other human species. It's a completely different picture.
A much richer, more dynamic picture.
Okay, so evolution happens over these vast timescales. How can scientists actually test it? There's that claim you sometimes hear that it's not testable science.
Another common point of contention. But the sources argue against that directly.
How? Can you really run an experiment on millions of years of history?
Well, not directly on the millions of years, no. But the sources argue evolution can be studied, even observed, in controlled lab settings, especially with things that reproduce really fast.
Like what, for example?
The classic example given is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Because microbes like bacteria have such short lifespans, generations pass very quickly.
So you can watch them change.
Exactly. Scientists can introduce an antibiotic and literally watch, in the lab, as the bacterial population evolves resistance. You see natural selection happening, leading to superbugs.
That sounds pretty testable, observable, repeatable.
It's presented as a clear case of evolution in action, right there in the sources.
Okay, what about the fossil record then? We talked about the missing link being misleading, but there's also the claim that there are no intermediate fossils found, zero transitional forms.
Right. The sources tackle that claim head on, too.
And what do they say?
They state pretty clearly that this claim is false, that intermediate or transitional fossils do exist and have been discovered.
Do they give examples?
Yes, specific ones. They mention fossils that show traits of both dinosaurs and birds, like having feathers and reptilian features.
Okay, like Archaeopteryx.
That's a famous example, yes.
Yeah.
They also mention fossils linking fish to amphibians, showing the transition from water to land, and things called therapsids.
Therapsids, what are they?
The sources describe them as transitional forms between reptiles and mammals, showing features of both groups.
So according to these sources, the fossil record isn't empty of these forms at all. It actually documents these transitions.
That's the picture presented, yes. That the evidence is there, showing change over time.
Interesting. Now, here's a different kind of challenge mentioned. Morality. The argument that human morality somehow disproves evolution. How is that addressed?
It's a fascinating argument. The sources actually present a counter perspective that sort of flips it around.
Flips it. How?
Instead of morality disproving evolution, the idea presented is that a basic sense of morality or fairness might actually be advantageous for the survival of social species, including us primates.
Advantageous. How can being moral help you survive, evolutionarily speaking?
Well, the perspective offered is based on studies suggesting this. Even some animals show basic fairness or empathy. Think about it. If you live in a complex social group,
Like early humans did.
right, for that group to work, to stick together and survive, you need some rules, some checks on purely selfish behavior. Unchecked, lying, stealing, violence that could tear the group apart.
So having some innate tendency towards cooperation or fairness or empathy might actually help the group survive better.
That's the idea presented, that a predisposition towards certain moral behaviors could be favored by natural selection because it benefits the group's overall success and cohesion.
Wow. So morality isn't necessarily outside of evolution, but could be understood through an evolutionary lens, at least in part. That's a surprising take from the sources.
It definitely challenges the assumption that morality must come from somewhere entirely separate from biological or social evolution.
Okay, now we've touched on this a bit, but let's look closer at the alternative viewpoints presented in one of the sources, the one that distinguishes between small changes and the big molecules to man picture.
Yes, the source from Answers in Genesis. It frames its arguments based on what it defines as observational science.
And what does that mean, according to them?
It means science that deals with things you can directly test, repeat, and witness using your senses. Right here, right now, essentially.
Okay, so based on that specific definition, what claims does it make about evolution?
Well, one key claim is that there's no known observable process where new genetic information, like brand new code for complex features, gets added to an organism's DNA.
Instead of gaining information.
It argues that observed genetic changes usually involve sorting existing information, or even losing information over time, like mutations breaking things.
Okay, that's one point. What else?
Another foundational claim they make, based on this observational standard, is that life has never been observed spontaneously arising from non-living matter, abiogenesis.
So no observation of new information being created, and no observation of life starting from non-life.
Correct. And using these points, framed by their definition of observational science, this source argues that the grand molecules to man evolutionary narrative isn't plausible according to their scientific criteria.
It's crucial to understand that this argument hinges on their specific definition of what counts as observable, testable science, especially for past events.
Exactly. It highlights a fundamental difference in approach and criteria compared to how historical sciences are often viewed in other sources.
That context is absolutely key. So, final stretch here. Is evolution still happening to humans? And this idea of witnessing evolution, can it be done?
The sources are pretty clear on the first part. Yes, humans are absolutely still evolving. It's not over.
And they give that really striking example, right, about milk.
Yes, lactase persistence, the ability for adults to digest milk. That's presented as a trait that evolved relatively recently, becoming common in some populations only within the last few thousand years.
Just a few thousand years. That's practically yesterday in evolutionary terms.
It really shows that evolution isn't just something in the distant past. Our genes are still responding to our environment, our diet, our societies.
And we still carry traces of older adaptations.
Definitely. Including, as we mentioned, those little bits of Neanderthal DNA for some of us. Our genetic makeup is a living record of our past and ongoing adaptation.
One source even muses that future humans might look quite different because of these continuing changes.
It's entirely possible based on evolutionary principles. Now, about witnessing evolution.
Yeah, can anyone actually see it happen in the grand sense?
Well, one perspective presented in the sources frames evolution as a historical science.
Meaning, like geology or cosmology?
Kind of, yeah. It means it's confirmed not necessarily by watching the whole multi-million-year process unfold in real time because, well, you can't.
Right.
But instead, it's confirmed by piecing together evidence from all those different independent fields we talked about. Fossils, genetics, anatomy, geology, biogeography.
So the evidence from all these separate areas converges, paints a consistent picture.
That's the argument. That the sheer weight and consistency of evidence from so many directions provides strong confirmation. To reject evolution, you'd essentially have to reject fundamental findings across many established sciences.
Which is an interesting contrast to that observational science standard we discussed earlier.
It is. That standard seems to demand direct sensory witnessing of the entire process, which is different from how historical sciences usually build their conclusions based on converging lines of evidence.
It really underscores the different ways people approach evidence for things that happened deep in the past.
Absolutely. Different criteria, different conclusions sometimes.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive. We've journeyed through quite a bit of material here.
We definitely have. Unpacking myths, looking at the science presented.
Seeing how complex the scientific picture really is, much more than those simple diagrams. And also exploring those different viewpoints and criteria found in the sources.
Yeah, we saw how the mainstream scientific view rests on vast evidence from many fields. How human evolution was this messy, branching affair with other human species around, and that it's still ongoing.
And we also saw how some sources challenge parts of that picture based on their own definitions of science and observation.
Highlighting those different frameworks.
We really aimed to cut through the noise and just show you what these specific sources contain. So maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Given everything we've seen, that our understanding is always being updated by new finds, science is a journey, as one source put it.
Right. And given that there are these fundamentally different ways of looking at life's history presented in the material.
What does this whole complex, evolving picture of our origins, what does it mean for how you think about change itself? About the sheer scale of deep time, and about just how incredibly diverse life is all around us?
Something to definitely chew on.